We've got 14 now, 14 people here.
Okay. And sincere apologies for those of you who registered through the FEI versus our community of practice. I understand there's just a little bit of a timing issue. I think the glitch occurred with the I guess the change in the alignment of time zones across North America and Europe. So sorry for the trouble if you happen to need to rejig your schedule in order to be here. And to those of you who are watching the recording who had planned to arrive at 10 a.m., a very sincere apology for the inconvenience. All set?
Yeah, are we good to go? Anybody, maybe just raise your hand if you're still working on it. Looks like folks are ready to go. So I have 14 people. 3 of us are going to stay in the main room. So I'm creating 5 breakout rooms. Go ahead and create those, and I'm going to open up all of the rooms.
If I could, Bill, just really quickly, to set the expectation that please take a couple of minutes each to introduce yourselves, and then feel free to engage in sharing your responses to the survey, especially what you hope to get out of this session, sort of why you're here. We'll give you all about 8 to 10 minutes to engage in that conversation and see you back here very shortly.
Towards something. Oh, thanks for remembering that, Randy. If somebody from each room could just say if you had a sense of something that might be a focal point for our open conversation in the latter part of the session. So that's why we sent this survey. We have some thinking based on it. It's helped to guide our thinking, Daniela, Randy, and I. But if each of you from each room could just maybe say something that might have come out. So we'll start with room 2. That was Laura, Morgan, and Serena.
I guess I can speak to our room. I wouldn't say that there was a ton to guide the conversation later. All of us were just interested in learning more about CBS and just kind of seemed like our room is just excited to be here and to connect with people and to meet people and talk more about everything.
Cool. And we had a sense that would likely be the case, Morgan. So thanks for that. That does sort of fit with our expectation. Great. Room 3, Mitchie, Sean, and Tim. Do one of you want to speak?
I'll jump in. We actually didn't dive too much into the topic. We were more getting to know each other sort of personal academic backgrounds and main focuses and things like that. So we stayed that way, but we did come up with 2 sort of interesting phrases. Mitchie mentioned the idea of sort of setting the conditions for change and the idea of behavior change at the center. Those were 2 sort of points that might pivot into this discussion.
Great. Thank you very much. Room 4, Anthony, Bernd, and Sarah.
Anthony is running away. Would you like to say something, Sarah? We met some allies here.
No, on my side, I was extremely happy to meet the people behind the work that I've been reading for a long time. So for me, it was pure happiness. And I'm very curious to know more about the ongoing work on CBS as well as flourishing business models on this.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Last room, Michael, John, and Hani. And welcome, Amanda.
Yeah, I could go. It was largely just kind of introducing ourselves, making some connections, seeing some overlap in our networks, which was nice, and understanding kind of wanting to learn more and how to apply CBS.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. This is very helpful for steering our conversation later in the session. In particular, sort of validating our sense that many folks who are coming are really here for learning about CBS. And so I think that Daniela, Randy, and I had already come up with ways that we might use that later section. So thank you. And Amanda, I'll send the link to the survey that we were just discussing. I just sent that to you directly. So if during the update section, if you have time to fill that out, great. If you don't want to divide your attention, that's fine. We've kind of gotten the information that we need from it. But why don't we go ahead and shift to the update section? Does that sound good, Randy and Daniela, or is there anything else that you wanted to address up front here?
Well, given that we're a relatively small group and we now have a really good concept of what everyone is trying to get out of the session, I wanted to propose something a little bit different, which affects our dialogue. My sense is that the majority of those here are still kind of getting familiar with context-based sustainability, trying to make practical sense of what it looks like in the field and how it might be useful. And I think if we are to delve a little bit into some of the details, the concepts, how it looks in practice, it might actually be useful to take Daniela's updates on our context-based sustainability study, which involves looking at how things are happening in the field, both applying CBS and in its absence, and use the examples that we would have otherwise just shared as updates as topics of conversation where we can engage in more of an open Q&A and delve deeper into the details. So I was going to suggest that we delay Daniela's update until the dialogue and have that be sort of the centerpiece for an open discussion about elements of CBS. Any thoughts, Daniela, Bill?
Sure. That aligns with what we just sort of discussed briefly. So I think that sounds great. So that just means shifting the order for the local futures, which should be fine. But
works out really well because John has to leave at 1:30, likely because he was prepared to be here at 10 o'clock for 90 minutes. But in any case, John is the project director on the Local Futures Project. And again, if you're interested in links and more information, you'll find details in the Word doc that I put into the chat just as we came back. I'll add the link again in case it's buried. So John has very kindly offered to share a little bit about the project for the group, and it's something that we'll definitely want to continue following. And of course, as we learn and have experiences through that project, this will be a great forum for sharing those as we continue. So over to you, John. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, and hi everybody. And I'm joined by my colleague also, Laura Carpries, on the line. So sorry I have to leave in a few minutes. Wasn't anything to do at the time. It's all on my end. There's just kind of managing a bunch of things on over here that have come up. But really pleased to be working with Randy and kind of the broader CBS community on the Local Futures Project. So kind of in a nutshell, we're trying to bring the international lens of the Sustainable Development Goals, these high-level goals at the UN that every country has signed on to direct sustainability and kind of a vision for the future, trying to bring them into our communities more effectively. And so the project we've built out, funded by the federal government in Canada, is it's around municipal university partnerships. So we'll have 5 sites across the country. And looking at how do we localize these goals in our communities. So that's kind of the foundation that we're trying to build from. We're also working with the Tamarack Institute to bring in a collective impact approach. So how can community work together collaboratively to advance shared goals, which, it's always been important, but in these times seems especially important. And then we have the CBS approach that we're layering on around how can we create more effective approaches to data at a municipal level to talk about kind of our planning, our resiliency, our approaches in community. So kind of in a nutshell, that's what the project is looking to do. It'll be a 3-year project, and we are situated at Conrad Grebel University College, which is affiliated with the University of Waterloo. So it's on campus as well.
That's beautiful, John. Thanks so much for the intro to the project and sharing a little bit about the background. It'll be exciting to see how things unfold over the next couple of years. And yeah, I'm equally excited to be working with you and Laura and the rest of the team. So cheers. Thanks for joining.
Since you need to leave, John, are there any questions that folks have about that project? It just seems to make sense to pause now to just at least see. And not seeing.
It's my intention to kind of plug in more to the community here. So, hope that we have more chances to chat and to explore, a lot of these big questions that CBS is looking to unpack. So
Great. Thanks so much, John.
thank you.
Okay. And good to meet you, Laura. So we'll go on. Again, we're going to just shift the order here. So I'll go ahead to the bioregional carrying capacities update. So I will just throw into the sidebar. This is a link to the overall series on bioregional carrying capacities. This is something that emerged from in the context of the designs for regenerating Earth. So the Design School for Regenerating Earth is a global community of, I think at this point, thousands of people globally who are focused on the bioregional movement and bioregioning, the act of organizing into bioregional contexts. And so in our collaboration, we at R3.0 have focused on context-based sustainability and in particular assessing carrying capacities at multiple different scales. But really the bioregional scale is kind of a missing link at this point. It's a scale that doesn't have as much attention and therefore not as much active application at that level. So we're trying to address that. We are doing this through a series of 90-minute sessions where we invite in experts on the topics, and they present for about half of that time, and the second half is open dialogue amongst participants. So late last year, we launched it. I did a session just introducing the idea of bioregional carrying capacity measurement and management. The second session actually featured Randy and I talking together about the next layer down in scale municipal carrying capacities. The next session in February featured Avit Bomik and Anders Bjorn, two really important and prominent researchers in this space. Avit Bomik talked about his Powers of 10 study, which is a very important one. It basically identifies the community of about 10,000 as a sweet spot for enacting change. And then Anders Bjorn presented on absolute environmental sustainability assessment, which is a form of context-based sustainability. Finally, this past month, Mark McElroy presented on context-based assessment of bioregional carrying capacities. That's one that I would strongly recommend seeing, as it did. Hey, Ralph. That did give a bunch of nuts and bolts. And then finally, the next session will be on the 14th, so on Monday, 3 to 4:30 UTC. So, and we provide a handy dandy converter on the website for that. And this is going to feature Isabel Carlisle and Nick Paling of the Bioregional Learning Center in Devon, UK, to talk about the Devon Donut. And that is an application of the donut economics concept of social and ecological thresholds. So that just gives you a sense. I think that this is a very helpful learning opportunity. So just wanted to give you a sense of the availability of that resource and look forward to speaking with you all in the future. Oh, and we're in preliminary planning to feature some university studies on this one in the next month. So May would be with a group from the University of Washington looking at Cascadia, applying the planetary boundaries in Cascadia, and then Daniela and a student of hers, Emma Mintz, at University of Guelph, doing sort of a literature review around carrying capacities and looking at that at the bioregional scale. So,
Bill, I thought from a learning perspective, it might be interesting just to note, I guess, a central theme in this conversation about bioregioning and how CBS fits in. One of the sort of not unique, but let's say advantageous features or design aspects of context-based sustainability as a methodological piece is the idea that it links across, it applies at any scale and then is designed to link scales. So many of you would know that a lot of our work has been focused on the municipal scale. And this conversation about bioregioning is actually quite interestingly and opportunistically related in that as we think about making change at the local scale, there is some necessity to think about boundaries, but there's also a necessity to think about lower scales and how we link things upwards so that overall, whatever sort of design or solution we come up with can definitively, or at least give us confidence that we, in aggregate, are likely to or have the possibility of realizing our goals when it comes to respecting thresholds. So it's something we can unpack further for sure in conversation. And maybe there's a question or two that occurs right now about this idea of scale, scope, and thresholds as a concept. But I thought I'd mention it just to sort of make sense of how we think about how we're thinking about the municipal scale versus the bioregional scale, et cetera. Any additional questions or thoughts?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in here as well. To that point that you just made, Randy. What I find fascinating about the bioregion is that it all seems to come down to water, and that like mapping out, like having different layers of different maps, whether that's like wind, droughts, geology, geography, like all sorts of different mapping exercises on like to determine even like potential boundaries of bioregions. And it seems like a lot of it centers on how water flows. And to that point, I found the connection to context-based sustainability so strong because then it determines the threshold of water available in a certain contextual, like in a certain area, which then obviously helps to determine allocations or make that linking across scales possible. But it is just such a different way of moving away from the planetary boundaries as such and recognizing really the locality of certain impact areas like water.
Yeah, I think that's water in particular, as Daniela notes, is one of the key organizing principles of bioregionalism, although it also intersects with sort of cultural and social dynamics as well. I guess one thing I'll also say is that the context-based sustainability and its sort of agnostic or open approach to scale enables what some people call scale linking. Daniel Christian Wahl, who's well known in the bioregional community, has a very good paper, academic paper on the notion of scale linking. But essentially, it's that we're not just able to look, or I guess I'll say it this way. I think what context-based sustainability enables is right now, we're largely looking at scales in isolation. So we're looking at, say, a municipal scale and doing an assessment using context-based sustainability. But I think as practice matures at the bioregional scale, we'll be able to do a kind of linking where we see, okay, well, what does progress or regress at one scale? What does this imply for progress or regress at broader or lower or higher scales? So I think that's a particularly exciting aspect of starting to look at bioregionalism, because we didn't really have an intermediate scale. There's been work that's been done at the national scale, and then there's work that's been done at the municipal scale, but very little work at intermediate scales. Any questions or comments about this? We're kind of using this again as an opportunity for some just information conveying and early education, if you will, around different aspects of context-based sustainability. But if there aren't any further questions, I think we can shift on to the SSHRC study. Yeah, Ralph.
Yeah, I just wanted to, first of all, apologize for being late. There was urgent work that I needed to do for our conference organizers. I just want to report back, and I don't know if you had updates or something like that already in your agenda. I was at a conference yesterday where really for the first time, many people who see themselves as bioregional representatives in the Netherlands actually gathered together, and where we also clarified what we understand by bioregions, and that led to a lot of discussion. Very often because the region that people are living in, they see that as the bioregion, which is very often, of course, not the case, because these are artificial boundaries created a long time ago with other things in mind than watersheds. But the interesting thing was that there was a starting discussion about how to measure carrying capacities in these regions, but also overall in a bioregion. So I just wanted to report that back to the group here, that there is a growing interest in that coming from that conference that was more or less only the Netherlands. But we think that this will spread moreover because we also now have several bioregional groups in the design school for regenerating Earth that are also have access, like everybody, to the bioregional carrying capacities dialogues that we're also doing at R3.0, which of course always also inherits the question of context-based sustainability. So I think the group should be aware of that. There's more interest coming.
Great. And that does remind me of one thing that really comes up in particular at the bioregional scale, which is data availability and the fundamental importance of data. And this is one of the things that Mark McElroy pointed out in his session, is that often it's the availability of data that guides the assessment. In other words, you can't assess performance if you don't have the data for that. And that's one of the things that makes bioregional assessment particularly challenging, is that data doesn't tend to be gathered in a bioregional way. And Cascadia is a perfect example of this, in the sense that it crosses the international border, the national border between the United States and Canada. And so Cascadia, that has been traditionally a challenge for bioregional work in Cascadia. And this particular University of Washington study on the planetary boundaries, they're encountering a similar issue of there being robust data on one side, robust data on the other. But generally speaking, data is not gathered according to bioregional boundaries. And so it's just an additional layer of challenge. So I just thought that might be worth pointing out. And I see we do have a couple of questions. How do concepts like carrying capacity fit for social and economic issues? So that question starts, I think, to open up to our, where we're going next with the agenda. So Bernard, I think that's a great question, and a fundamental question of, I think that we know how it applies better, or there's been more practice on the environmental side as compared to the social and economic side. Danielle and Randy, do you want to integrate an answer to that, a response to that, into the updates around the SSHRC, or should we go ahead and just take that right now on its own?
I'm a
Is
little
it
bit unclear about the question itself, in terms of what, yeah, I would love a little bit of an elaboration just to understand maybe what's under the question, or to have a more nuanced or detailed understanding of what we're getting at, so that I can address it well. But maybe, Daniela, you already have a clear idea of how you address it.
more clarification is always helpful.
Yeah.
I'm happy to take a crack at that if you'd like me to.
Please.
Great. Thanks, Bernard.
Sure. You know, I'm particularly interested in sustainability as it applies to issues of justice and equity and inclusion and things like that. And so much of the conversation that I hear here seems to be directly focused on the environmental or ecological challenges we face. And so I'm just looking for some insight or guidance to say, how do the constructs, the practices, et cetera, that are being talked about here, how can they help us with work in the social and economic arenas? Does that help?
Yeah, that does help, Bernard. And actually, I guess I would say that this question makes absolute sense, and we encounter it regularly. And so I'll start to respond and see if Daniela and Randy have additional responses. But many people associate carrying capacity almost exclusively with environmental or ecological impacts. And that's understandable, because carrying capacity is most closely associated with the field of ecology. And so people think of, well, what's the relationship between an elk and wolf population, and what's the carrying capacity in terms of the food resources in particular of a certain area. So that's totally understandable. Mark McElroy, in his dissertation from 2008, which, if folks don't know that, it's well worth. I mean, PhD dissertations are not exactly light reading, so understood if that's a little scary. But I've read that his dissertation a number of times, or at least parts of it. And one of the things that he does is he introduces in that the application of the concept of carrying capacity to social resources, or what he calls anthropogenic capitals. And it is in some ways counterintuitive, or at least it doesn't fit into our general sense of carrying capacity. So it applies in the sense of, when we're looking at carrying capacity in an ecological sense, we're often looking at what is the maximum degree of impact, and particularly adverse impact, that an ecosystem can handle before breaking down. And so it's often viewed as a maximum, or in the language of the donut, if you will, an ecological ceiling. If you step back and consider it, and actually the term carrying capacity was first used in the late 1800s to apply to the carrying capacity of ships, particularly around taxation. So it was like, well, what levy do you apply to a ship's cargo when we're shifting from the world of steam of sailing boats that had more capacity, to steam engines that took up a bunch of that carrying capacity with the machine that was on it. That's literally where the term carrying capacity emerged in the late 1800s in a letter from the U.S. Secretary of State. And so what we can see is that that's a social construct. It's looking at, well, what's the taxation or the levy that's associated with this cargo. I just give that anecdote by way of saying, when it comes to social carrying capacity, we often think of, well, what's the minimum amount of support that is needed in order to maintain a stable social situation, a foundation, it's often referred to. So that's, I think, in particular, one of the reasons why people are challenged to think of applying carrying capacity to social impacts, but it's really this sort of minimum versus maximum that's the primary differentiation between them. I hope that helps, Bernard, and Randy and Danielle, if you wanted to jump in on top of that.
Yeah, what I would just maybe very briefly add to that is that the carrying capacity that we're talking, like the context in which we're talking about here is the CBS context, the context-based sustainability, which in its core looks at a systemic perspective using different capitals that include the environmental as well as social. So from that point of view, talking about the carrying capacity of a particular system does, by the definition of the capitals, also include the social component. But I also think it's important to always remind ourselves, because interestingly, you bring up the focus on the ecological and the need to also consider justice, equity, and inclusion, other elements, which is important. And interestingly, there's another thread of conversation in like the area I'm in accounting, where there was recently a call for a special issue to say, oh, when we talk about sustainability related issues, we often tend to look at the social aspects, and where is the environment in that conversation, like bringing the E back. So there's both of that going on, and I think it's a very important question and an important reminder to make sure we're capturing both. And I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I just felt like carrying capacity, as many terms, can mean a lot of things for different people. And I think on the CBS grounds, because of the capitals, it's kind of written in, and to the bioregion that Ralph earlier mentioned already, like a different understandings also of what bioregions means. From the conversations we had with Cascadia, their understanding of bioregions is also bringing the people back into that conversation of bioregioning. So yeah, important point, and I don't know if we've addressed it adequately.
I was thinking that I might want to add one thing. A lot of this discussion around thresholds, allocations, also stems from the discussion with donut economics and the outer and the inner ring of the donut. So the outer ring is normally the environmental side and captures the carrying capacity of planet Earth. But not to forget that there's this inner ring as well, which is the social floors, as they were often called, or Daniel Christian Wahl, who was already mentioned, called it the caring capacities. So from that perspective, this concept of the carrying and caring capacities build the inner and the outer ring, and to be within those two boundaries just marks a possibility for being in balance or being within the allocation that is given to a certain institution, organization, or region or municipality, to be in balance with the concept of one Earth. So in that sense, the social part that derives very often as stress from the environmental side is also captured in the concept of context-based sustainability. Evenly governance aspects are captured there as well. So I think the overall paradigm is one that includes environmental and social aspects.
Great, thanks. I guess the last thing I'll say on that particular front is I'll put a link to a study in the sidebar that I often use to demonstrate bioregionalism and its use of both ecological and social dynamics. It's a study from British Columbia that showed that bear populations, these subspecies of bears, were clearly delineated geographically, but they didn't know why. And as soon as the researchers overlaid a map of indigenous languages, they saw a very close relationship. And I find that fascinating, that literally human culture and bear species boundaries or the areas that they use for their feeding align so closely. So that just is an illustration of that. But my sense is that this is fulfilled our sort of objective of using this for education and for deeper explanation of the dynamics of CBS. I think it might make sense to do as we had thought about before, which is to use the SSHRC research project as an opportunity to continue to delve deeper into the dynamics of CBS. So Daniela, maybe hand things over to you for that update / substantive agenda point.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to give you a brief overview of our research project, which I've shared with this group a while ago, that we had secured a one-year project fund from the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And so for those of you who haven't been in in the group when we introduced that, we had received funding to document what happened in the case of Nanaimo and their attempt to trying to adopt the donut economics model, and then at some point sought out for other support or support from other sources, and then adopted context-based sustainability from the state that they were at. So it wasn't, initiated from a starting point, but from the assessment where they were at that time, and then worked with the method of context-based sustainability, which then helped to transform the way in which they approached sustainability performance measurement. And that is a very interesting case in itself, for which we're reviewing city documents, internal documents from the CBS consultation process, of which Randy was a part of as well, an important player here in the CBS consultation, then recordings of reflections on the process, also with the sustainability manager of the city of Nanaimo, Ting Pan, who has also spoken to this group at an earlier meeting, and then public speeches and interviews with different involved individuals. And we're also now welcoming Serena Günther to our team of researchers. Serena is here on the call as well, and she has already started spending some time immersing herself into the literature of the donut economics and CBS guidance, the Nanaimo contextual documents and histories, and we'll work on that documentation part of the Nanaimo case study in the months to come. So hi, Serena, and thank you for joining the team, and welcome. And so another part of that research project was not only to look at what happened at Nanaimo, which in itself, I think for many here with an consultation background or interest, is very interesting to see how their journey unfolded. But we also had another part there looking at how other municipalities that have not applied CBS, but also similarly to the city of Nanaimo, trying to adopt the donut economics model, how their experiences are, why and how they have been engaging with the donut economics model, and where they're at in terms of their authentic sustainability performance measurement. And when I say authentic sustainability performance measurement in terms of the donut economics literature, then referring to what Ralph said earlier, the donut economics model refers to the outer boundaries, like the planetary boundaries, as a ecological ceilings, and then the social foundations, and the space in the middle is defined as the safe and just operating space. And so for municipalities then to assess whether or not they are in that safe and just operating space, or whether they are making progress towards that, that would give them an authentic assessment of their sustainability performance. And so that was an interest of ours. Also, in particular, triggered by, say, Randy's initial experience with the city of Nanaimo, realizing that in the process of trying to adopt the donut economics model with the guidance provided by the Donut Economics Action Lab, led to some confusion or unclarities, or like to a point of getting stuck where it seemed like context-based sustainability was then helping in providing a structured process in actually meeting that goal of defining these authentic sustainability performance measures, which was helpful for Nanaimo. And now, just as a side note here, we have asked the cities we've interviewed as well, what they found inspiring or why they're participating in our research, and what they found inspiring about Nanaimo. And some of them really said they seemed like they had it all together. And so like they seem to have, they are perceived as having more clarity as something where these cities want to get at as well. So on that notion of why some of the municipalities, like that to say, we're still in the process of conducting interviews during initial data analysis. So we haven't gotten to that part where we can now present like the study itself, but we would like to share with you some of the initial patterns and our interpretations of what came out from what we've heard so far. So on the question of why some of these patterns, why some of the municipalities adopted the donut economics model, among those was that it's an interesting visual. So we heard, for instance, from Grenoble that they said it's really interesting because we in France, we don't really like, American pastry or donuts, but then having something like a donut always sparks interest of what is it, and you get the attention. So it's the visual, but also the wording of they call it like the funny word. So it brings people into a communication, it brings interest to different stakeholders. And then like beyond the just initial interest, what we're hearing a lot is that the visual brings the different dimensions of what is important to the forefront of people, including politicians. So the connection of the importance of the different dimensions of the donut was really helpful in conveying the message of this importance to or with politicians. Some of them were driven top down from a political agenda, where it was said that this city, for instance, was working to become a donut city, or working to meet sustainability goals using the donut. And then there were resources made available in the municipalities to provide guidance or to do the work. And then the other municipalities had more of a, I would say, a bottom-up approach, where they said, we want to have something that works for civil servants, and recognizing that there are different departments that work in their own silos, and that seemed to be something that provides an umbrella. So other motivations on that were then simplification. So they had mentioned that they really like the idea of simplifying individual plans like mobility, housing, infrastructure, whatever like the individual plans are, and bringing that together on one bigger, more connected level. And the other that is very closely related is then to bring departments closer together and to integrate and coordinate their efforts of sustainability. So that's their aim, right? That's the reason why they're motivated to adopt the donut, which is also helpful then in seeing where some of the work gets stuck. Now, on the level of how, most municipalities have started with a donut portrait, and I don't know how familiar you're with that, but it brings together, again, coming back to the social and ecological part, it brings together a social dimension and ecological dimension, and invites municipalities to think of those two dimensions from a local as well as global dimension. So local would look like, how can all the people of this place thrive, or how can this place be as generous as the wildland next door? And we have our own thoughts about why the wildland next door, but that's a whole different conversation. So that's just what's posted by the donut guidance, like what could regeneration look like here? So that's the local. And then on a global lens, they're invited to then think about how can this place respect the well-being of people beyond this place, or how can this place respect the health of the whole planet. And so the deal recommendation is here to invite stakeholders to have engagement exercises, they provide tools which helps facilitate workshops, brainstorm perspectives, and dive into each of these questions or quadrants more deeply. And now the municipalities, to different extents, have engaged in these exercises, and it also relates to, why they have started in the first place. Like those who started from a civil society perspective had less of that engagement. And sometimes also when there was a political drive, then there was a position installed that then worked through the donut economics model almost like in isolation, and then stakeholder engagement was brought in later. So what we find was interesting here that there is an encouragement to bring in stakeholders to brainstorm, but then once this step is complete, the municipalities who refer to that part sometimes as an ideal, the reality of what is possible appears to be very different. So two things here to note. One is that there's this discrepancy between that first brainstorming and then what the municipalities are doing. And the second, that there seems to be a not so clear understanding of when and for what purpose stakeholders are brought in. So if they had started to work in isolation, they then bring stakeholders in at a point where it might be more meaningful to bring in experts instead and not have a broad brainstorming of ideas. So there's an unclarity of that element of stakeholder engagement and the purpose of it. And on the notion of the different approaches that the municipalities then took on that, I call it the what is doable, is that they had this ideal and then started to speak with different departments to see what information has been already collected, what indicators are already in place, what data is available, and basically from there develop the sense of what's doable, and then develop targets, believing that these targets are thresholds, and then these targets will then tell them whether they are working towards sustainability or not. So it appears from our conversations that we had from the interviews that there is an unclarity about what a target is and what a threshold is. And very often their approach to setting their sustainability performance system is based on the data that is available. And then we have heard this, for instance, coming out in responses like, oh, we'll set this for now, but then once we have moved in the right direction, we're moving the thresholds to a more ambitious line. So we're tying them back to something more ambitious. So there seems to be this understanding that you can move thresholds, which indicates that they haven't actually applied science and ethics-based thresholds, because you couldn't move them around as you approach or meet them. We've also had other paths observed where like the working groups indeed come up with indicators that they seem to describe more or measure more of that ideal, but then got political pushback for reasons such as the government body didn't want to ascribe to indicators they felt like they had little control over. So in our own sense making and interpretation so far of what we've been hearing, we know that there's some confusion about the scope at which the sustainability performance indicators are developed. So while DEAL, the Donut Economics Action Lab, guides municipalities to work with a lens of community as a local space, municipalities are then often left with their space-based portrait and the question how to steer towards it, as their duties and responsibilities of the municipality are not clearly defined in that exercise. So there are departments which are concerned with housing, for instance, or other tasks, and they are working within the constraints of the municipal organization and their internal decision criteria. And the bigger picture of that organizational, like communal space, somehow feels disconnected in their decision making in comparison to what they have mapped out in their donut portrait. We also, like, this is on the notion of scope. We also noted that the materiality, as they are prescribed by the donut economics model, they're pre-prescribed, I'd say. For some municipalities, they felt too rigid. Some have mentioned to us that they have worked to adapt it, that they had other aspects that they felt like couldn't fit in or needed some extra space, while others, or I'd say maybe most of the ones that we've talked to, have adopted the donut dimensions almost in an unreflected manner to find like indicators for each of the dimensions rather than assessing from their perspective, from the local context, what matters or what's meaningful. And then there's a concern here that this approach to just applying, from a point of view of what's available, but also just mapping on some indicators to some, I'd say, I wouldn't say random, but just like some prescribed dimensions without recognizing the local context almost creates a sense of false confidence that what the work that they have been doing was already good. And where we see that translate as a problem is that now municipalities come into a next phase and politicians are less likely, or they've run sometimes into problems of getting funding because it seems like the bulk of the work has already been done when in fact it hasn't, because they've mapped out the portrait, but they haven't implemented it for the context that would have been meaningful for the municipality. So like just to wrap that up, there's still a lot of work to unpack for us and to discuss. This is kind of an early reflection on the work. We still also need to unfold what we're seeing with the existing literature and theories, but maybe as discussion points for this group here, we would perhaps like to highlight the unclarity about scope, materiality, the confusion about what thresholds are and why allocations are meaningful, and then how to determine indicators. And I'll bring in the targets here because I mentioned earlier that there is this confusion about targets or political targets or municipal targets and science and ethics-based thresholds, and that they are not interchangeable, and that from what we have seen in the guidance as well as in the understanding of the municipalities, that there's a confusion around that. And with that, I would like to wrap up and hopefully have some time for questions as well.
That was great, Daniela. Thank you so much. Randy and Daniela have been taking lead on this research, so I appreciate this opportunity to learn a little bit more, even though I'm involved in the research. So thank you. I'll also just mention briefly that Daniela will be speaking at the R3.0 conference in September, and this is one of the elements that she'll be integrating into that presentation time. So just a little bit of a promotion for a future event there. Questions and or comments or inputs around the work that Daniela just explained?
I would also offer, in case it's of interest, I mean, we can do very specific compare contrast in terms of like what happened at Nanaimo and instances of where results were different versus in cities that we observed, et cetera. So like if you're interested in an example or something more concrete, like we can take the discussion anywhere you'd like in service of everyone's learning. So please, feel free to poke away at any aspect of this to ask for more information, even if you don't have a specific question per se.
Maybe, Randy, there was a comment that you've responded to from Bernard on the aspect of participation and engagement. And maybe if that makes sense, you can perhaps share some of your response also as to knowing when and why to include stakeholders in your experiences. Perhaps that might be helpful.
Sure.
And particularly getting some of this on the recording. So it's great to respond in the sidebar, but also having it in the recording is helpful.
Well said. Yeah, I appreciate that and happy to dive in. So, from the perspective of context-based sustainability, at least the methodological aspects of it, you know, context-based sustainability applied is not in its entirety a participatory process. Yet, the way that the portrait method is laid out, essentially all of the steps are intended to be done with community. Everything is participatory. And from the perspective of achieving authenticity in what we're measuring and the outcomes that we're trying to produce, that's not actually helpful. It would diminish the results to participate in this way. So I'll be more specific. Um, in terms of how context-based sustainability unfolds, we begin by defining a clear scope. What is it that we're measuring the sustainability performance of? Is it the community? Is it the organization? Is it some sort of smaller group? Once that's clear, the second piece in CBS is around determining materiality. So this to say, what areas of impact are most important to measure and manage? In simple terms, without getting into all the methodological guidance, materiality is determined based on the purpose of the organization. And I'm not talking about like making money. I mean, the actual purpose, why the organization exists in the world, what benefit it creates for society or otherwise, and its duties and obligations to stakeholders. So you might ask the question, what is a duty or obligation? Essentially, a duty or obligation is owed to any stakeholder who is impacted positively or negatively by the existence of the entity, whether that's a community, whether that's a municipality, a business, etc. From there, once we establish what's most important to measure as part of managing our sustainability performance, we begin to develop indicators and metrics. And that's where thresholds become important because they become our way of determining whether or not we're performing sustainably and by how much. When we go deeper into indicators and metrics, there's another point at which engagement becomes really critical, which is around determining allocations. So if we take the example of a watershed, what's important to note is one organization could, on their own accord and based on their own perspective, decide what a fair, just, and proportionate allocation of the capacity of that watershed is for their organization. So if we take a municipality, let's say the municipality says, well, we have X percentage of the population that relies on this watershed, so our municipality should be allocated the same proportionate amount of the carrying capacity of that watershed, that its annual renewable supply of water. Unless that outcome is produced through the engagement of all the other stakeholders who are dependent on that water resource, it's not considered a fair, just, and proportionate allocation because it's not equitably informed. We've come up with our own assessment of what's fair, just, and equitable. And in real terms, that should be a function of the perspective of all of those who are impacted. There should be a shared belief about how that allocation should be performed. So this is to say, when we're deciding what's most critical, given the purpose of the organization and who it's impacting, and when we're deciding how to make allocations or think about thresholds and context, how we establish what the denominator should be in our indicators, it's really important from a CBS perspective that is an inclusive and equitable process for it to have credibility and to ultimately be useful. Unfortunately, when we get into a process where everybody's contributing to all aspects of things, for example, we sit in a big room with lay people from the community and people that don't necessarily have a connection to science, and we start discussing, well, what's most important for us to look at in measuring sustainability performance? And we have conversations and people's preferences determine what we should measure. That results in us measuring things that from a complex systems perspective are not the most important. And if I don't think I need to make an argument to the group that, we need to be quite disciplined in understanding and navigating complexity and having general conversations about people's opinion when it comes to what's most important from the perspective of understanding a complex adaptive system isn't a very helpful contribution from a participatory perspective. But that said, of course, as I've mentioned, there are several different points in the process where the voice of people are necessary. So we're often seeing in the context of donut cities, this sort of very participatory approach is leading to a term that I've used that, or at least been exposed to, is satisficing, where we're not actually concerned with the output, we're concerned with making everybody happy first and foremost. So there's a satisficing focus or element to how we're making determinations that should really be informed by the best science and the best experts available, or expertise available in a certain context. So ultimately, we're actually taking ourselves further away from optimizing our ability to navigate towards the safe operating space for humanity by obscuring what's important and how to think about that. I hope some of that landed. I know it's complex, but questions? Amanda.
Hi. It's been fascinating to listen to, and this work is really close to home for me. Most of my work is with municipalities, and I'm a facilitator and an engagement specialist. So this is lots of dinging going off in my brain. When I work with municipalities, one of the main lenses is really their risk aversion, and especially such a hierarchical organizations, depending on the municipality, some more, some less. And I'm wondering if you could just speak broadly about that push and pull when you have a client who it sounds like you've been working with, or municipalities you've worked with, where they're very open to listening. But what happens as these ideas move up the decision-making chain, either with senior leaders in municipalities or councils that might not be as open to the science and open to what you're proposing, and some of that push and pull and navigating that. I'd just be interested in that.
Yeah, thanks so much for the thoughtful question, Amanda. Really appreciate the question, the insight, and can very much relate to the sort of dynamic that you're describing. And I think the conclusion that we've drawn largely is that, you know, for the conversation to go somewhere meaningful, we need to be engaged with the most senior leaders of the organization, and in terms that are very much grounded in the very purpose and primary function or responsibility that they hold. And so I guess in brief terms, I would say the point where we found resonance is that in the current paradigm of management within the municipal sector, the risks are actually not visible. We are flying blind and increasingly realizing the unintended consequences of that as complexity increases and change accelerates. And I think municipal leaders have been stretched to the limits of what they can manage while flying blind. And so the idea of understanding risk more fully, more authentically, and being able to navigate forward in a manner that's authentic and aligned with the commitments that we make externally to our communities and in our strategic plans becomes the point of leverage. Not everybody's going to get on board for sure, but I think the pathway that has been the game changer for us is this idea of managing for complexity and appealing to senior leaders about the fact that their entire paradigm of management is inadequately sophisticated for the complexity of our reality today. I hope that helps.
Thanks.
Cheers. Yeah.
Thanks.
May I add something?
Of course, please.
Hello, everybody. I'm not clever enough to ask a question. I'm experiencing severe tension, and so maybe I could just surface the tension and we see where it goes from there. So for a little bit of context, I've had two very different careers. The first was a corporate career, but it was so long ago, it was before ESG. So all that existed at that stage was corporate social responsibility. Since then, I've been much more involved in kind of grassroots activities, and I'm involved in a very small bioregion, 90 minutes outside of Cape Town. My naive dream has been to build bridges between the boardroom and bioregions. And having sat on this conversation, I think I've just been reminded of how naive I am, because it's two entirely different worldviews, sets of language, approaches. It's just, you know, night and day. And I loved the comment that I think it was Bill that posted on the sidebar about Lila June Johnston's work, where, and specifically he ended by saying it wasn't achieved through qualification, but through cultural alignment with natural systems. now I can only speak for our bioregion, but I'm pretty sure that the same is true in other bioregions. That cultural alignment with natural systems is the only thing that bioregions are interested in. And the language and the actions and the motivations around that notion is completely different to the motivations and the objectives that we're trying to achieve in a call like this. And so that's the tension. I don't know where I'm going with this. I don't even know if it means anything or lands anywhere, but it's a huge tension for me. And just wanted to share that. Apart from that, thank you for the rich and inspiring conversations that I've been sitting and listening to, but not really participating in. Thank you.
Michael, thank you for voicing and presencing the tension that you're feeling individually. Often that's not just happening individually, but others may be sensing into that. And it certainly taps into a tension that I've navigated throughout my time engaging with CBS, which is this. I think that the focus on quantification certainly is a product of a, call it, Western mindset, if you will. That said, I think that it would be oversimplification and even risk romanticizing to think that indigenous cultures don't or even are contrary to quantification. I think that most indigenous folks that I engage with are like, if there's a new tool out there, we will gladly look at it, as long as it isn't used to colonize or oppress us. So there isn't necessarily, and again, this is a generalization, but there isn't necessarily a sense of being against quantification in indigenous communities that I've engaged with. What they're against is quantification being used as a tool of colonization and oppression. And so I think that the indigenous regenerative ecosystem design that Lila June Johnston talks about is really using sensing and observation. So I would say the original empirical method of observation over generations, and using that to design landscape scale management systems, including food systems that were sustainable. And so I don't necessarily see a conflict between context-based sustainability that's looking to achieve sustainability through quantification and IRED, which is seeking to do it through, I would say, applying cultural principles. It would be one way of looking at it. In fact, I think that the regenerative movement and the sustainability movement will probably benefit by embracing one another rather than sort of rejection. So I hope that helps to at least explore the tension. And I'm a big fan of what I call generative tension. I think we shouldn't run away from tension, but rather embrace it as a learning opportunity. So I hope that helps, Michael. Great. In the sidebar, we've just got a few minutes left, and I did want to give Bernard an opportunity, if you're open to it, just to comment a little bit on sort of what was behind your question, in particular around the notion of the kind of large group processes for co-creation and the potential that might have something to offer to context-based sustainability. Do you want to say a word or two about that?
Sure. For me, my thinking is very basic around that. I think that all of this work has to be done by people with people, and the extent to which we can figure out useful and powerful processes of engagement, all of this work, I think, will be elevated. I completely agree with something that Randy said earlier. We have to be conscious and thoughtful about when and where and how we engage with others. That makes total sense. I think all of the large group work I've done over the last several decades, begins with putting together a sort of a cross-disciplinary, multi-stakeholder group to design the processes of engagement, which of course, begin with, what is it we're trying to accomplish? Who needs to be in the room for those conversations? What conversations do we have? And we get into, of course, questions then of the difference between diagnostic and dialogic processes for engagement and so on and so on. But let me stop there. That's what I was thinking of. It feels to me, when I feel like a real outsider to the work that you all are doing in many ways, and yet my own passion is around finding strategies for engaging the business sector in building a better world. And I've written a number of things on that, but I do believe that that as with all fields, I think we can benefit from the question of how might we more effectively engage the different stakeholders in this process of going beyond brainstorming, which is kind of useless, I think. Thanks. That's it.
Thanks, Bernard. And I do think that engaging impacted stakeholders is absolutely fundamentally important to context-based sustainability. And so doing so in the most strategically effective way is key. And so you may find us reaching out to engage with you further on this question of large group engagement, because sometimes that is part of what CBS needs to do. I do see that we're just about at the end of our session. Randy, Daniela, are there other particularly logistics that we need to cover before we close things out here?
I don't think anything logistical. Just as the final word, I wanted to offer that, this research is in the process of being compiled and analyzed and eventually published or at least reported upon. There's so much more progress to make, and it always feels like, the updates are a little bit incremental in terms of sharing a little bit more and a little bit more, but not having the substance of something truly complete or well organized and documented to flip over to the group. But please be patient with us. Keep sharing opportunities and ideas for doing this stuff in practice. If you have questions along the way, keep them coming. If the conversation we've had today sparks some other questions or ideas that you've had, don't hesitate to reach out to us directly.
Yeah, and on that note, I really also appreciate the resources that all of you have shared and your own experiences. I do, setting up that call kind of puts us, I think, unconsciously into a position of, I don't know, hierarchy, which I don't mean to say, but for the lack of a better word. So the group in its, the core intention of this group was the sharing of experiences, or Amanda, you said, oh, I experienced that risk aversion. So unpacking that more, seeing how that played out in your work, this would be, very insightful for all of us. Also, it's not a one directional point. And I think I wanted to emphasize that I really appreciate the sharing of your resources in the chat, as well as the things that you have said throughout the call. And I think there's a lot of learning to do for all of us. And I think it has been highlighted here too, that we're all involved in all sorts of different groups, and bringing these knowledges or languages together, I think is also really helpful. So thank you everyone.
I'll add my final thanks to everyone.
Well, don't forget to stop the recording.
Won't do that, Ralph. It's on Randy's computer, so this.
Oh, okay, it's on Randy's.
Yeah, this isn't an instance that will require work for you, Ralph.
Okay.
We're on the R3.0 line.
I was just saying that because I was not the host of the call, which I normally am.
Thanks again for joining, everybody. It was really wonderful to see everybody. Have a good one. Keep in touch.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.